My big brother is there. My 3-year-old daughter, visiting her in-laws' home for the first time, pointed to an old storehouse and said so. I was shocked by her words. It couldn't be. No way. Actually, 5 years ago, my son, who was then 2 years old, went missing around my in-laws' home. It was a place we had searched extensively at the time. But if my daughter says so, maybe it's true. Because she has a mysterious power. As I opened the heavy door with trembling hands, an unbelievable sight met my eyes. It was also the moment when I was freed from a long suffering. That was 3 years ago, when my daughter Emma was born. Now that we have Emma, let's forget about David. My husband Nick told me so. But I think it's better for Lucy. Biting my lip, I held back from arguing. It might have been his way of showing concern for me, but I could never forget about my son David. It was my negligence that led to his disappearance, and I had been blaming myself ever since. The day the incident happened 5 years ago was the end of April. Can you go to my parents' house today? Nick, usually kind, spoke unusually firmly then. Sure, but what's the sudden plan? Is something up? My parents are preparing party for David. They wanted to welcome their first grandchild. Located in the countryside, over 2 hours away by car, visiting my in-laws was not easy. We both worked, with my husband employed at a major company in New York, and I worked from home as a translator, so visiting was challenging. I felt a heaviness in my heart. But thinking of my in-laws as my true parents, I decided to dutifully pay them a visit. There was another reason we seldom visited the in-laws. My mother-in-law had always been harsh towards me. However, having lost both my parents, I told myself to endure, and leaving my husband who had to work on a holiday, I headed to the in-laws with my son. Upon arrival, the heir, our grandson, has come. My in-laws greeted David with great enthusiasm. However, as expected, my mother-in-law glared at me sharply. Nick married a worthless wife. Not only did she take away our son, but she also keeps our grandson from us. I'm sorry. My work has been so busy, and it's hard to find the time. I've never liked you from the start, with arrogant attitude, just because you have your job. She hurled thoughtless words one after another at me. You changed our son. Even though he is our heir, he isn't coming home. But that was Nick's own decision. I don't want to hear that. It's all your fault. No matter what I said, my mother-in-law wouldn't accept me. My father-in-law, standing next to her, was kind to me but couldn't stand up to her and pretended not to hear. If my husband had been there, he might have defended me, but at that moment, all I could do was endure. Yet, my son was thrilled with fascinating decoration in the house. Furthermore, the in-laws owned a large, prestigious brewery and their beautiful garden. Mommy, here. Take this. My son approached, holding a flower petal in his hand. He was giving it to me as a present. Thank you, David. I responded, and David smiled contentedly. At that moment, my father-in-law said, Lucy, I'm sorry to bother you, but could you help me with some luggage? I was to help him carry about 10 large cardboard boxes into the storehouse. Come on, David. I took my son's hand as he crouched under the cherry tree, admiring the petals, and left him with my mother-in-law inside. While I help your grandfather, please take care of David. My mother-in-law didn't even look at me, but pulled David close and smiled warmly at him. Relieved to see this, I returned to the garden to help my father-in-law. After a while, having carried all the boxes inside, I rushed back into the house, but my son was not with my mother-in-law. Where is David? I asked her. Huh? I don't know. He said he was going to you. He hasn't come. I panicked and searched inside and around the house, but he was nowhere to be found. My son had vanished into thin air. Where could a 2-year-old have walked to? Perhaps into those mountains? Behind the house was a dense mountain, and I feared he might have wandered into it. David! Where are you? Answer me! Mommy's come to get you! I searched desperately, my voice hoarse from shouting, but there was no reply from my son. Upon my call, my husband also came and comforted me, grieving, "You're not to blame. It's useless to keep searching." That very day, my mother-in-law started saying such things. "Please, can you report to the police and ask the locals to help as well?" I was desperate and begged my mother-in-law earnestly. "I won't allow it. Reporting to the police would look bad. It's all the mother's fault for not watching him." "I'm sorry. But rather than blaming, we need to find David now." "That's right, Mom. We can't worry about what others think now. I'll go ask them myself. If Nick insists, I guess there's no helping it." Convinced by my husband, my mother-in-law reluctantly agreed and contacted the locals. I felt tears well up, thinking Nick was indeed on my side. "Thank you. I'll call the police then." "Lucy, maybe hold off on that." "Why?" "We need to find him fast. In a maze-like countryside, locals know the area better. The police might prioritize looking for a perpetrator over searching. Let's just let the locals search for now." I followed my husband's suggestion, hoping just to find David soon. However, despite a large turnout from the locals, my son was not found. "We really need to report this to the police." "Yeah. I'll go right now." An hour later, my husband returned home, saying they would expand the search to the deep mountains and consider the possibility someone had taken him. "Please be found soon. Please be safe." Yet, no matter how much we searched, my son was not found, and 3 days later, I was brought back home by Nick. Even after that, worried about David, I visited my in-laws' home alone numerous times, searching the mountains and surrounding area. "It's your fault the heir is gone. Don't ever come back here again." But I was detested by my mother-in-law, and eventually, I could no longer approach my husband's family home. In hindsight, maybe I should have searched quietly without telling anyone. Even in such circumstances, Nick always sympathized with me. I think we should cut ties with my parents who are always cold to Lucy. One day, he suddenly declared, "Are you sure that's okay? We don't need parents who make you suffer. Also, let's stop searching for David. I'm worried about your health." Ever since our son disappeared, I had been unable to sleep at night, and I hardly ate, becoming so thin that my bones were showing. Persuaded by my husband, I chose to believe that David was being taken care of by someone and is still healthy and well. Eventually, I became pregnant with our second child, a girl, whom we named Emma. I never forgot about my son, but I decided to pour all the love I had for David into raising Emma. Interestingly, Emma seemed to have a peculiar ability. For instance, when I was looking for something without telling her, Emma would often bring it to me. Once, she even saved me out. As we walked through a nearby neighborhood, she murmured, "That big brother over there wants your purse." Just as she said, a young man on a bicycle approached and reached for my bag. The moment I switched the bag to my other hand, the man lost his balance and fell. The culprit was restrained by onlookers who had seen everything, and he was safely handed over to the police. After such incidents, I believed Emma's abilities were real. However, when I shared this story with my husband, he found it creepy and wouldn't believe it, so I stopped talking to him about it. As Emma grew up and turned 3, she suddenly asked, "Where are my grandma and grandpa?" Her words took me aback. Thinking about it, my in-laws had indeed showered our son with love. Overwhelmed with grief, I hadn't considered it at the time, but my in-laws must have been just as saddened by David's disappearance. I wondered if it was selfish of me to keep Emma from meeting them. So, I decided to discuss it with Nick. "We've cut ties with those terrible parents. There's no need to let them meet our daughter now." He opposed the idea vehemently, his expression stern. But his reaction felt oddly unsettling. In hindsight, it might have been a clue. A few days later, without telling my husband, I took Emma to visit my in-laws' home for the first time in years. Upon arriving at the nearest station, I called to say we were about to take a taxi there. Oddly flustered, my father-in-law said, "I'll come pick you up right away," and abruptly ended the call. Already in the taxi, I tried to call back, fearing we might miss each other, but the phone didn't connect. As we neared their home, Walking down the path leading to my in-laws' house with Emma, she suddenly pointed to a storehouse behind the building. My brother is in there. What? I hadn't told her about David. Her sudden word was inexplicably strange. Could it really be? Driven by desperation, I peeked into the dim storehouse, and what I saw was astounding. A boy was chained to a post, his eyes wide open in shock. It was my beloved son, whom I hadn't forgotten for a single day over these 5 years. David! I rushed to the entrance of the storehouse, but it was locked. I repeatedly struck it with a hatchet I found nearby, and perhaps because the lock was old and rusty, I managed to break it open. At last. When I hugged my son, tears flowed freely. Who are you? Are you here to save me? He looked at me curiously as I said, let's get out of here right now. Looking vulnerable, he murmured, did Grandma and Grandpa lock me up here? Is that okay? Impossible. Shocked, I was at a loss for words. My in-laws were involved in the incident of my son's disappearance. I'm your mom, David. I've been searching for you all this time. To free him, I grabbed some pliers from a toolbox in the corner of the storehouse and cut the chains. Then, with the children, I hurried into a trail off the road. Having entered these woods many times in search of David, I was somewhat familiar with the area. I needed to contact Nick. Taking out my phone from my bag, I hadn't noticed until now due to being preoccupied with saving my son, but there were numerous missed calls from my husband. Hello, is that you? Lucy? I finally got through. I'm heading to my parents' house. Don't talk to any locals. My husband blurted out something nonsensical about not trusting people from the countryside. He knew we were at my in-laws without me telling him, likely because my father-in-law had contacted him. Why was he so against me contacting the locals who had helped search for David when he disappeared? So, where are you right now? At the station, waiting for your father to pick me up. Feeling uneasy, I decided to lie to my husband. Oh, good then. Relieved, Nick still seemed off to me. I continued walking down the trail with the children, stopping at a house along the way. It was the home of the Mr. White, a couple who had helped search for David 5 years ago. Hello. David has been found. When I spoke, they looked at me with puzzled expressions. What are you talking about? Wasn't this child found right after you left? What do you mean? I was told he was found soon after in the storage shed at your house. That's not true. As I stood there confused, Mr. White added that he had been told by my in-laws that I had run away due to an affair and that they were raising David in their home. That's a lie! As I vehemently denied it, Mr. White said, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. The locals believed the story from my in-laws because they occasionally saw Nick returning to his parental home and even saw David at his school entrance ceremony. Could it be? Nick was also deceiving me? This is too much. Shaking with anger over the fact that I had been separated from my son for 5 years. At that moment, Emma gently took my hand. Mom, I'm glad my brother was found. She smiled and for the first time held hands with her brother David. While he looked perplexed, he gazed at Emma and then up at me. His expression, previously stern, softened as he stared into my eyes and tearfully asked, You're really my mom, aren't you? You didn't leave me, did you? Apparently, he had been taught by my mother-in-law that Mom abandoned you. He had been brought up as the heir, a role that included severe discipline, and he wasn't even allowed to seek comfort from his grandparents. I took out my phone and showed him the many pictures of us together until he was 2 years old. Mom never forgot about you for a single day. We'll always be together from now on. David nodded in agreement. Just before meeting me, my in-laws had received my call and taken David to the storehouse, chaining him up and ordering him to stay quiet. Thinking about how frightened my son must have been, I felt a burning anger. This is unforgivable. Mr. and Mrs. White, having witnessed our situation, offered their help. I immediately called my father-in-law and husband, telling them I was at the Mr. and Mrs. White's house. The first to rush over in a panic was my mother-in-law. You can't just take our grandson like that. She began to furiously lash out at me, looking like a demon, and tried to hit me, but Mr. and Mrs. White stopped her.
This child is my son. You lied about him being missing to deceive me.
That child isn't David. He's my daughter's child. My mother-in-law tried to claim, unbelievably, that he was her niece's child.
No, he's my big brother.
That's right. This doesn't add up. This child is Nick's, isn't he? My mother-in-law stumbled over her words and averted her eyes. Then, my father-in-law arrived and shouted, "We've disowned this daughter-in-law," and tried to take David away. But my son, who didn't want to leave me, was forcibly pulled away by my father-in-law.
Stop it! Can't you see he doesn't want to go?
Mr. White stepped in too, trying his best to protect my son.
Lucy! What are you doing? We cut ties with my family. Let's go home.
Then Nick came running over, his face red with anger, and said to me,
I won't be fooled again. You were the one who took David away from me.
Don't talk nonsense. Haven't I always been on your side, Lucy? I glared sharply at my husband, who was still trying to dodge the truth.
I can't trust you anymore. I've decided I'm not letting go of this child.
I don't know this kid. David is gone. Just give up. Even with his son in front of him, my husband kept denying it. Hearing this, David stiffened and asked, "Am I not Daddy's child?"
I don't know you.
Still, Nick continued to hurl terrible words at him.
I won't forgive you. This time, I'm going directly to the police. Even if you say such outlandish things, they'll just laugh it off as a family dispute.
My husband tried to escape the situation, but it was not to be.
I have evidence.
Actually, I had been meticulously recording everything since David disappeared, thinking it might be useful someday. I had noted down every trivial detail, including capturing on my cell phone the sight of my son chained in the storehouse.
I don't know about that. It was all my parents' doing. I had nothing to do with it.
Nick, what are you even saying now? Weren't you the one who said to make David the heir in your place?
Mom, stop. Don't say anything more.
My mother-in-law argued back at Nick, who continued to feign ignorance, and they soon began to argue vehemently. In their attempts to justify themselves, they hurled insults at each other, and all the truth came out. On the day David disappeared, Nick had conspired with his parents, taken David from the kitchen back door, and driven him away in a car parked a short distance away. Then, he temporarily left him at his sister's home in a distant town, and when things cooled down, brought him back to his parents' home to be raised by them. That's why I couldn't find him no matter where I searched.
So, you pretended to have disowned your parents and kept me away from here, right?
That's right. And yet, you had to go and bring Emma here on your own, and now you've blown our cover. This whole ordeal was orchestrated by my husband, who, tired of being blamed by his parents for not having an heir, wanted to continue living in the city and offered his son as a substitute.
You're the worst, only thinking of yourself.
But I had no choice. I hate the countryside. I had to hand over David. You would have opposed it anyway, wouldn't you?
Of course. Who would willingly give up their child?
That time Nick stood up for me, and his mother's performance was just to ensure I wouldn't report anything. He had only told the locals to look for the child, and of course, he hadn't actually consulted the police. I was completely deceived. I'm sorry. So, let's not go to the police. David is fine now, isn't he? That's right. I raised him with love, so it's okay, right? Besides, we're not a family. My father-in-law also bowed his head and said, "Please forgive us," as my husband and his parents begged tearfully.
There's no way I can forgive you. I never want to see your faces again.
I firmly refused and pushed the three of them away as I faced them. At that moment, the sound of a police siren approached, called by Mr. White. When the police arrived, I showed them the photo of my son chained up, and my in-laws and husband were taken away in their car. Later, my husband and his parents were interrogated and arrested. I divorced Nick and filed for a divorce settlement of $30,000 and child support of $300,000 for the 2 children. Additionally, I demanded $20,000 in damages from my in-laws. Fearing the severity of their crimes, my in-laws gave up their land and property and paid in one lump sum. My husband, convicted, lost his job and is now living by juggling multiple part-time jobs to make the payments. Incidentally, the 3 tried to sell their house but ended up unable to sell it and are still living in the same place, ostracized and shunned by the local community. Well, it's only natural since they had deceived everyone. Unbeknownst to my husband, I am living peacefully with my 2 children. David smiles more than before, and he spends his days happily with his sister Emma, making me very happy now.